Yes, mate.
About what?
The situation. I'm sleeping.
Being worse, being better. Company's definitely better. No, but these bunkers are quite good actually. Underground ones, quite secure. Clearly haven't been tested out by artillery yet, but this probably can take about 20 men comfortably. They've got a log fire to keep it warm. Temperature's not too bad at the moment, but as winter comes, it's going to be dropping here.
Person that's become a good friend of mine in my time over here through just some old military contacts with is Emile, and a bit of a mentor for me through this industry. Has talked about sitting down and having a chat with me about this industry. So, thanks, mate. And,
yeah, no, cheers.
Yeah. If you could just sort of describe your experience and how you actually came into this industry for me.
Yeah, so my name's Emile Ghessen. I'm a former Royal Marine Commando British, as you can tell by my voice. So yeah, I'd done 12 years in the Royal Marines, between 2000 to 2012. I served Iraq, Afghanistan, several tours, and then left as a rank of sergeant in 2012. And then I went into the private security industry, which a lot of military men transition from the military into private security because it's easy, because we've all got contacts. So I'd done a bit of close protection, a bit of anti-piracy work, and it was pretty boring. And then the war in Syria started. And I had this idea, as my father's Syrian, I'm British, but my father's Christian, Arab, that ISIS has started growing and men were going out to volunteer to fight with the Kurds against ISIS. And I came up with this idea to go follow these men, to go, what motivates them to fight, since that I'm a former commando, got the experience, my family are in Syria, why do I not want to fight? But this man who I've met in a pub wants to. So I literally went on eBay, bought a camera, and then moved out to the Middle East and started traveling around Iraq and Syria for about 2.5 years, filming volunteer fighters and what motivates them to fight. I then went to film school for a year, and that's a wasp, and then made a second documentary in Ukraine about volunteer fighters and what motivated them to come here post 2014, because this is the second part of the war that really started in 2014. And then I went to Nagorno-Karabakh with the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020 to cover that war for a big feature documentary I made. And now I'm back in Ukraine here with you.
And from your experience in war previously, how does this war differ? Even how does it differ from 2014-15 on the initial invasion or the first part of this war?
In 2014, there's a revolution. People rose up. Russia snatched, land grabbed Crimea. Pro-Russian separatists supported by Russia rose up in the east, and then within a year the Minsk agreement was agreed and there was a bit of a ceasefire in Donbass, but there's still tensions. What happened here on February the 24th was Russia went full out war on Ukraine, where their military actually entered the sovereign territory with their uniforms, with their flags, saying we are coming into Ukraine. In 2014 it was more of a proxy war where Putin used pro-Russian separatists and little green men in Crimea, which he denied to be Russian forces, but we all know they were. They just weren't wearing badges as such. So yeah, this war is very different to what happened in 2014. It's also very different to other wars I've experienced, because this is a conventional war. It's not a war, even though I fought in Iraq, that was a conventional war, but not in the sense of two big forces fighting against each other. In Ukraine, it's very much an artillery and rocket war now. We're in the 6th month of the war and it's been ongoing. A lot of people saying when's it going to end, no one really knows. So yeah, this is a very intense war and it's across a massive battlefront. I think a lot of people don't really appreciate how big Ukraine is. A lot of people think Ukraine's all that war, the whole country is getting bombed everywhere. That's physically not possible. Even during World War II, which went on for years, not everywhere was bombed, but even though the country was still at war. So there's parts of Ukraine you can go to which are quite peaceful and life's going on, but there's other parts like this area here where at any moment we could be attacked, and that's the reality of what's going on here. Even the cities like Kiev, Lviv and everything else, at any moment in time rockets could fall out of the sky.
And can you explain where we are at the moment?
So we're in an area called Kharkiv, which is it's about 20 miles from the Russian border. This is this city has been under attack a lot during the war. Why this city is crucial is because the majority of the population are Russian speaking rather than Ukrainian speaking. They're closer to Russia. Russia's got more of an influence on this city. So Russia thought they would take this city very quickly and they failed. Very much so now that the Russians have been bombing it heavily for months now. There's a lot of civilians still in the city living and carrying on with life. Even yesterday, 5 people died?
Yeah.
So it's still very intense here. Ukrainians at the moment are pushing them back, but the problem you've got with Kharkiv is because it's on the border with Russia. Russia can reinforce its troops. Logistics is easy for them. So I think this will be a battle that's going to be ongoing in this region.
And why do you think in that 2014-15 time that the Russians had some success with their separatists being able to land grab and then sign a Minsk agreement, and this time it's been sort of back and forward? The Russians have now been, well, on the defensive as Ukraine pushes forward, and there's been absolutely no talk of any peace agreements, whatever. What do you think has changed there?
I think in 2014, the Russians were denying they were involved in what was going on. They were saying it was people rising up, wanting their right to self-determination. So really, by proxy, Russia were fighting in 2014. So because there was that detachment of them actually physically being involved in the war, it was easy for them to go to the negotiating table. What's happened in 2022 is obviously Putin's special operation went in, where Russian forces are actually involved, and he's committed his troops into the country. So for him, it's a harder backtrack to move out and to talk about peace and talk about agreements when he's physically involved in it. In 2014, he wasn't so involved at the time. Well, Russia wasn't so involved at the time, per se. So at the moment, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. No one wants to go to the negotiation table. A lot of the Ukrainians I speak to, and probably yourself, is they want to fight because they're fighting for their land. They're saying, well, what are we negotiating? The only negotiation there should be is that Russian troops return back to Russia.
And, it's very obvious that a lot of this information coming out is through a lot of either media outlets that have some sort of objective, or this war's being fought online through Telegram and TikTok and Russian accounts and Ukrainian accounts. How much does that information war and sometimes the misinformation feed into both trying to report and the operations at the front?
Yeah, it's a great question. Throughout history, since man's fought, there's always been a war that's been fought in the information space. People used to call it propaganda. Some people still call it propaganda, but it's more now fake news, disinformation and misinformation. The information war is just as important to win as the war on the ground. One, for deception for your enemy. Two, to keep morale up of your troops and your nation. And three, to get external support coming in. So yeah, the information space here is massive. Even if you think about World War II posters, and they're my iconic posters. Now we have the world of the internet where people can get information very quickly on their phone. They can be sat on the toilet, sat at home, on the train, at work, and they're consuming information very quickly. So it's very important to shape public opinion on what's going on with this war to win that information war. The Russians and the Ukrainians are very good at information, disinformation and propaganda as such. Well, even Americans and Brits and Australians, the whole West is very good. They know they need to control the narrative. I saw it very heavily with ISIS. They were very successful compared to Al-Qaeda with their information and how they told the story to make them look more fearful than what they were. I saw it in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, lots of propaganda. And here in Ukraine, it's massive. We all know, like even this morning, you asked me, oh, what have you seen last night on the internet? What's going on? As a filmmaker, journalists, we get a lot of information from open source, like even mainstream media. And I work in the media, but I'm not working for a company. I'm totally independent, self-funded. That we don't have a narrative. Certain news organizations have a narrative, and we know this. We saw this in the war in Syria, for example, where everyone was anti-Assad, anti-Russia. They supporting the Free Syrian Army, which in my opinion are the terrorists. But the West supported them because that suited our narrative. When it comes to the mainstream, they supported that narrative to support what the government was saying. What's going on here is a lot of people have lost trust in the governments because COVID, fake stories and stuff like that. So there is the average person at home is very skeptical of mainstream media in this day and age. And that now transpires into what we do in media and what we're doing here, where people say, well, this war isn't happening. That person, that body, I've had it myself, people go, that dead body in that picture or that video isn't real, it's fake, it was placed there. So there is that really, that it's turned upside down, that so many people don't trust what they see. And that makes our job hard to get that information to go, no, this has just happened. But yeah, the information space is full of disinformation, and it's constant battle for people working on the ground, and even the consumer, people watching content to go what's real and what's not, because the good guys and the bad guys use it to their advantage.
Yeah. So, as someone who reports on the war, how do you sort of peer through the fog of that and get to what is real?
Yeah, that's the hardest part. You've got is not taking things at face value. Is searching. Is not just saying one bit of evidence or one bit of evidence presented to you and go, right, that's factual. You need to check multiple sources. You need to check who's reporting it. What kind of account is it? Like even last night, where the Queen died last night, and then news outlets were saying she's 98 when she died, when she was age 96. It's simple details like that. First thing I've done was I checked who was saying it, what source are they, how credible, what other posts are they doing, are they a real outlet, are they a fake outlet? Because here in Ukraine you get people that are lying about things. News outlets, so you've got to see information, because years ago when we used to get information, it used to be through the radio, newspapers and television. They were the mainstream media were the gatekeepers to information. Now with the phone, everyone can be a gatekeeper. Everyone like myself and you, even this content here is going out to the masses. It's not being vetted by anyone. No one knows what I'm saying as if it's true or not. People have to form their own opinion. So when it comes to searching online, people need to be very wary of what they're reading, fact checking what they're doing. Even it comes down to who's writing the story. What is their bias? What is their motive potentially? And that takes time. That's what we do for a job. That's our job. Person sat at home doesn't really want to be doing it. They just want to see things and take it at face value. Wherefore, people need to be very skeptical about what they're reading and actually form their own opinion from several sources. The problem we've got in this war now is because the West has blacklisted Russia now. So the Russian information space is very hard. So mainly in what's going on in Ukraine is Telegram channels. There's a lot of information that's getting out there. And if you go on Telegram, there's so many channels you can follow about covering this war, but there's so much disinformation and what's going on.
And with the people releasing this information, and you said that there is sort of that barrier of entry has just gone due to smartphones, we're getting a lot of people coming over here who may not have an experience in media or journalism or have their own agenda. Somewhat like myself, I had no experience when I came into this industry, and yourself had no experience when you first started in this industry. But what types of people are you seeing that are drawn over here? And do you think that a lot of them have their own agenda for this war?
Yeah, for my first two documentaries, Robin Hood Complex, they're both called, one Fight Against Islamic State and then Europe's Forgotten War, I've been following volunteer fighters that have been coming out here. And they've all got different motives on why they come out here. They all say, I'm going to go fight ISIS with the evil, I'm fighting the Russians with the evil. But really, a lot of them, they've got their own personal interests on what they're doing. We see that in the journalism world, in the media world also, where people have come into Ukraine because it's very easy to get to Ukraine. You get to Poland, cross the border, and you're in Ukraine. And it's very easy to get press credentials even. So this conflict is drawing a lot of people because it's closer to home, so it's easy to get. You wouldn't see so many random people turn up in Iraq and Syria because they don't understand the culture, the customs and everything. And they think it's really dangerous against a terrorist group. It's more dangerous here in Ukraine, really. So we're seeing lots of young journalists, a lot of people with no experience, like myself and you. We served in the military, so we understand hostile environments. We know how to interact around soldiers, for example. Okay, right, if the shit goes down here, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Lots of people that myself and you have seen here don't have that experience, and they're going around blind into areas. They're literally just checking one app and going, oh, it must be safe in that area because the map says it's safe in that area. They're not fact checking, and that's how at the beginning of the war many journalists were killed, and it's probably one of the highest number of journalists killed was here in Ukraine in the first few months of the war. So there's a lot of people that are very naive. They think that it keeps coming back. Everyone keeps talking about Call of Duty, that they've played Call of Duty or they've watched a movie and they think it's easy like that. But there's a serious risk in here, in this country, and I think a lot of people don't really understand that, and that's really disappointing. The fact is that the gatekeepers, the mainstream media, which I'm not saying they know what they're doing, but there's a lot more levels of check. They've got security, they've got consultants, they've got a team working with them. Here we're seeing many independents just rocking up, which I'm not saying they shouldn't come, because that's how I started getting into the industry 8 years ago. But people need to have a serious reality check on what's going on here in Ukraine.
And what do you think these young guys and girls wanting to get into this industry can do? Like, you have come from a military background, so I guess we're already a little bit ahead on environments like this. But if they don't have that background and are wanting to come here or do this type of work just in general, where do you start?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's a lot of people that might be watching this go, I want to be in war zones. I want to start reporting. One, there's not much money in this industry. It's a tough gig to earn real money because it's up and down. 1 minute you might be earning good money, next minute you're earning nothing. So that's one consideration people need to be bear in mind. But there's also, you can do heat courses, like high risk environment courses, where it's like a 3-4 day course. Some of them are 5 extended, where you learn about, when you go to a centre and they'll teach you about hostile environments, how to interact. Also, there's medical courses like the FPOS course, for example, to understand. You see all these journalists and they all wear their body armour and they've all got their med kits on them, but the majority of them don't know how to use a med kit. So it's having that training and understanding, just being more aware. It's like anything you do, any job, is that you train to do that job. And of course you can do on-job training, being here, learn from people, get experience being on the ground. But really you want to start somewhere rather than just coming in here, is because if you've never been in a hostile environment, places like Ukraine are tough places to operate if you don't know what you're doing. And 99% of the time you might get it right and you might go somewhere and survive. It's that 1% time that you get it wrong, and that's when it's game over.
So as this war has entered, I think now it's 200th day, is well over 6 months long. Do you see any end in sight, or do you think there should be some compromise made? Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel currently?
Yeah, it's a tough question, because me and you, we're just observers here. We come to countries like this, we observe, fly on the wall, just report what we see. But we also have an opinion, and me and you vary on opinions on certain things, and other people might vary on their opinions. My personal opinion, what's going on here, is, in fact, I'll talk about what I think will be the bigger picture first before I talk about my opinion. I think that we're going to move into winter. It's going to be a war of attrition during winter. There won't be so much movement of troops. This is why the Ukrainians are now doing their counter-offensive in the south, in Kherson, and up in this region here, ready for the winter, to push that line to then hold. I think potentially in early spring, if there isn't a new offensive, before then there might be negotiation, there might be some kind of term on how we're going to work on this. I think the key to success on the mediators in this war is Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member, but it's very close to Russia. So they're really the main country that can mediate, or a country from the Gulf, which has got influence with Russia. So I think that's roughly what's going to happen there, unless the war just plays out and continues for years on end. The good thing about this was Putin. He never declared war in Ukraine. He's called it a special operation. If it's a war, you win a war or you lose a war. It's very hard. He would want to win the war. Because it's a special operation, he has got that get out of jail free card that he can turn around and go, the operation's over now. We're just pulling back to Donbass, or we're pulling back, operations now ceasing, or we're moving into a new phase of the operation. So that is the saving grace, what he's done there. My personal opinion on what's going on here is that Ukrainians want to fight. There's no doubt about it. The West is supporting them heavily with weapons and money, and they appreciate it. There's constantly, they're thanking me and you for the support, to say, like, thanks for your country supporting us. I personally think that the West should continue supporting Ukraine for their right to self-determination, because I personally don't feel that Russia should be in the southern borders of Ukraine. And I say this all the time, like, picking a side when it comes to war, it's not like a football team. Is that you don't support them when they're winning and they're losing. When it comes to the war in Syria, I supported what Russia did to support the Syrian army to continue fighting against ISIS and also the rebels. However, what they're doing here, I don't support. In Nagorno-Karabakh, they went in as the peacekeepers. I supported them stopping the war. Here in Ukraine, I don't believe the Russians should be in Ukraine, and I believe it's the right of the Ukrainians to fight and continue fighting. But at the same time, where does it end? Where does it end if the West will keep pumping in weapons into the country? It prolongs the war keeps going, but the alternative to that, if you don't do that, Russia takes over Ukraine to a certain degree.
Yeah, what do you think of the statement people make about the West has done nothing but prolong the suffering of Ukrainians, as people believe the Russians will eventually win this war anyway, and it could have just been settled in 24, 48 hours, if not?
I don't think the Russians can win this war long term, but what's winning and what's losing? It's very hard to say what's winning. It's not like the Second World War where you're fighting Nazis and they lose, they get taken over, for example, and Allies win. There is no winning and losing as such. People that turn around and say by bringing weapons into the country, supporting Ukraine is prolonging the suffering of the people. I say that's total and utter bullshit, and someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. You will not find a Ukrainian in Ukraine that says that by the West supporting them is prolonging their suffering. These people are very proud people. They want to fight, they want the support, and they want to push the Russians out of their borders. So I wouldn't say prolonging it suffering the people's lives, because the people want that support. As such, and as long as they want that support, the West is going to continue supporting them. The government, of course, at the same time, want that help from the West, and we've seen the president, how PR savvy is. He's excellent in PR savvy to get the information out, and people go, well, how can he run a country if he's just always on television? He's the president. That's his job, is to spread the word. You've got generals, you've got commanders that are fighting that war on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, the end sight, no one knows what the end sight, and that is saved. That's the Ukrainians fighting.
And what do you make, as someone who's been here before the war, and before at least the invasion on the 24th, and has a lot of experience here and in the media, what do you make of, I guess, people talking about the neo-Nazi nationalists in Ukraine, and if you've had any experience with that? Because that's been, I guess, the big argument of the people on the pro-Russian side. Was really two arguments. Well, Ukraine was the ones that broke the Minsk II agreement that was signed post-2014, and that Russia is selling it, I guess, to people as we are fighting Nazis. And no one in the world would agree that a Nazi is a good thing. Can you just talk on that?
Yeah, this is
the success they have with that argument.
Yeah. That goes back to what we talk about, the disinformation information space. This is a very clever ploy of Russia to say the denazification of Ukraine, for example. I've been filming here for years in Ukraine. I've met guys that are Nazis and far right. I've met more people that aren't than that are, for example. People talk about Azov. I spent a lot of time with Azov. Azov in 2022 is a very different organisation to what Azov was in 2014, when it was just a bunch of football hooligans in Mariupol. It's a very different organisation. Is there Nazis in that organisation? Potentially, yes, there is. Of course there is. Is there Nazis in the British military? Yes, there is. Is there Nazis all around the world? Yes, there are. Is there Nazis in Russia? Of course there are. There's far-right people in every single country. The key issue here with the Nazi comment that the Russians use as propaganda is the fact is fighting Nazis during World War II was massive for the Soviets. If it wasn't for the Soviets, the Allies probably wouldn't have won the war, because they were so instrumental in that battle. So the narrative in Russia is the great victory. We beat Nazis in 1945. That rhetoric still continues in Russia now with Victory Day and stuff like that, where it's still our heroes, the Soviets, beat Nazism. When they now use that narrative in 2022, it plays on them emotional thoughts to go, we're fighting the Nazis again. The Nazis are back and they're in Ukraine. There are a lot of Nazis in Russia, without a doubt. I don't know how they can turn around and say there's Nazis in Ukraine, we're fighting for Nazis. And not only that, is like Putin will always go, we're fighting for the people, we're liberating the people. You don't bomb the shit out of cities until there's no building left and there's no people left in the city to say you liberate. That's not liberation, that's destruction. So very cleverly, the Russians have been using that propaganda of the Nazis to go, right, that's why we're going to war. Because the people back home who are getting limited information, they hear that rhetoric, Nazis are Ukrainians, yeah, we need to fight that good fight again like we did in World War II, let's go to Ukraine. It's just reinforcing their rhetoric and their narrative. In the last couple of months, that actually has died down a bit. In February, March, you know yourself, everyone was like, Ukraine's Nazis, they need to go to war. Is the country, even if the Nazis that are here are such a tiny proportion compared to what the majority of people are. So even if there is a small group of Nazis that are fighting in this war, the majority of people aren't, and the West should be supporting the majority of people to go fight against the Russians, to push them out of the country. Because even if they are Nazis, they're still fighting for their own nation at the moment. That's a domestic issue. I don't know what Russia's got to do with Nazis in Ukraine. It's not like Nazis in Ukraine are crossing the border and carrying out attacks in cities like Moscow. What is very telling, in fact, is like the Chechens, the war in Chechnya for years. But you have Chechens, Russians bombed the hell out of Grozny, but you have Chechens that are fighting for Russia. We've had several terrorist attacks in Russia from the Chechens, but Putin doesn't talk about that threat. He would talk about an external threat in Ukraine of Nazis. It's just reinforcing that narrative.
And what do you make of the narrative, or at least the story, about the Minsk II agreement? Because areas like here, Donetsk, Luhansk areas, part of the Minsk II agreement was those areas would have a referendum whether to become Russian or Ukrainian, as those areas were very new out of the Soviet Union. It's under 30 years at the time, well under 30 years at the time, and that they would have a referendum because most people there were Russian speaking or maybe Russian aligned, and that Minsk II was never actually implemented by the Ukrainians. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so Minsk II agreement that was signed in 2015. Since then, there's been several violations from both sides on that, Ukrainians and the Russians. Is the right to self-determination is like, I made a documentary in Nagorno-Karabakh, like I mentioned, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that region is ethnically Armenian, but on paper controlled by Azerbaijan. So people were saying, like, we need the right to self-determination. When it comes to Donetsk and Luhansk, people were saying, well, we want the right to self-determination. Do we get that independence? Do we get that referendum as such? The issue people have got, which they're turning around and saying, is that it's a sham referendum. It didn't really happen to the way it wasn't. It was a lot of corruption, that the Russians were giving out passports to people to say, you're now a Russian citizen, so their polls will go up, and they were fixing the ballot papers. That, of course, anything that comes to Russia, the West are going to call out and say that doesn't happen. Russia's saying, yeah, it did happen as such there. So there's a lot of issues. The Ukrainians haven't stuck to the Minsk agreement, and nor have the Russians. So it is a very grey area. And I think the Minsk agreement was signed too quickly. I think it wasn't thought out correctly and how long-term this is going to play out, because the tensions will still be there. Leading up to February the 24th, 2022, that ceasefire was broken daily by both sides, artillery and firing amongst each other. I was in the trenches 2016-17, and they're firing across it at night, just for fun. Both sides breaking that Minsk agreement. So I think it was very whitewashed. It wasn't implemented. There wasn't external organisations that were monitoring it as well as they should have been to prevent what was going on here. But this war here is really a legacy of what happened there. Putin talks about that, and before this war started, he's talking about Donetsk and the Donbass area being two independent states, having the right to self-determination. And I actually, to a certain degree, agreed with that. And I was like, well, yeah, if Russia moves into Donetsk, Donbass as peacekeepers, then what could happen is they can have the right to self-determination, have that referendum, correct vote, and then maybe Ukraine can move away from the war. Donbass is a very contested area. Even my personal opinion on this war, I don't think Ukrainians are going to get Donbass back. They might get cities like Ghesson in the south, Kharkiv and stuff, but Donbass and Crimea, areas that were seized in 2014, I think it would be a real struggle to get back. And I think really that's the long-term plan that the Ukrainian government needs to start looking at, is like, where do they make a concession? They need to make some form of deal eventually. They go, okay, we've lost this region. How do you move forward? Let's stop the war. Go back to the lines, for example, or February the 23rd and go, right, that's the new lines drawn on the map. And it's hard, and it's hard for many Ukrainians. You know yourself, a lot of Ukrainians will get very upset when you talk about Crimea's gone, Donbass is gone. And this is just my opinion, because it's not my land. It's easy for me to say this. But Ukraine eventually, to come to peace here, will need to make some kind of offer to Russia. Because Putin won't leave Ukraine failing. He will need to get something out of it. Yeah. And I think the key to that is recognition of Donbass, independent states in Donbass, and recognition of Crimea as being Russia. I think that's the only saving grace.
Yes. And both countries we're from have implemented fairly hard sanctions against Russia. Is this something that you think is a good play in the war or a poor play? Because in my opinion, in some of the sanctions I don't disagree with, but there are some where I think that isolating the average person of Russia may actually be very counterproductive in the long run, same as if we isolate their accessibility to media and to some of our Western stuff as well. Does that just make the average citizen think, oh, the West hates us, they're at war with us, rather than embracing the average Russian? What is your idea?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is many people have mixed emotions on this, on what's going on, and I think the West needed to act. They needed to do something to put pressure on Russia. Personally, my personal opinion is the sanctions have gone a little bit, well, not the sanctions, but the victimization of Russian people has gone too far. Is people go, well, they should stand up and do something about it. Millions of people stood up about the Iraq War, which I was involved with. I was a young Marine fighting in the Iraq War. In hindsight, I don't believe we should have gone into Iraq because it was made. We were told lies. We shouldn't have gone into to fight in that country. So when it comes to alienating a nation, imagine Americans and Brits were alienated from the world. Imagine American and British tennis players couldn't play at Wimbledon because their nationality. That's all it was. So I do think it's a bit too far in the sense of I agree with sanctions at high level government, and I understand there should be pressure on the people to go, we don't want this war, stop this war. But when you start pushing someone away, you then start turning them to the person you don't want them to be turned to. Putin looks stronger because when it comes to his problems, he blames it all on the West. So a lot of people in Russia will be like, our problems aren't the government anymore, our governments are you for giving us the sanctions on our government. And they will twist that. Should we ban Russians moving in, going on holiday, for example, into Europe? 100% no. But there is a definitely anti-Russian rhetoric from just the ordinary citizen, which I don't support at all. There are some Russians that you see that would say, yeah, we should be killing the Nazis in Ukraine. Then people are stupid. Then people are idiots. Anyone who supports this war here is, in my opinion, an idiot. But the majority of Russians probably don't support that. Well, I can't say the majority. But the problem you've got is you can't alienate every single Russian. And I think that's when you push people so far, Russia will turn into a state like North Korea. And we don't really want that. Because this war will end one day. And Russia is very instrumental to our economy. So it's very important that there's a way to bring them back. And I think at the moment there's a lot of hatred towards Russian people. It's unworthy.
Yeah, and I think there is also a bit of propaganda about how powerful Russia is or isn't. Because in the beginning of this war, we've seen a lot of
that's training, by the way. There's fire in there.
Training.
It's not real battle at the moment. Even though this area isn't an area where...
Still need to train every day. So, in the beginning, we saw a lot of absolute incompetence from the Russian military.
Yeah.
So the size of a military like that, from what we thought as Western soldiers, because all our training was to go to war with the Russians. It always has been on any side. But that incompetence we've seen, what do you think about the actual power that Russia has? Because, at least in my opinion, I'm like, well, okay, there's training of soldiers we may have seen and some of the movements, tactics of the vehicles, whatever. But at the end of the day, they're still a nuclear power. They're still something that we need to maintain like a UN relationship with. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, like you're saying, when we're in the Western militaries, and when I say Western, I also mean Australia as well. So even though you're not in the West, you're always training for that Russia war. It's always that war. Since the Soviets and Americans and the Brits met in Berlin, the Cold War started straight away, near enough. There's always been that tension that in order for NATO to succeed, it needs to have an enemy as such on paper. Or why am I going to buy weapons off you if I've got no one that's going to attack me? Russia might attack you one day, so you need to buy these weapons. So it is an organisation that does work off that fear to a certain degree. When it comes to the Russian military, how strong they are, I think it's a bit of a straw man, personally. I think that fear and that rhetoric and that narrative that Russia and Putin's been giving out for years, they're not as powerful, in my personal... I know you might feel differently. They're not as powerful as what they are. I think they're very engrossed in a lot of corruption. For example, at a high level of commander oligarchs in the military that have been giving out misinformation about how powerful they are. Of course, there's no doubt Russia has a big military and structure. It's how effectively it can fight. That's the issue. We saw for the battle for Kiev and to the north of Kiev how they failed that miserably because is it poor training? Was it poor leadership? Was it a feint attack? They messed up trying to seize the capital of Kiev, mainly because tanks were driving down main roads and getting ambushed. They didn't have the logistics, for example. Basic things that you would do. They thought it'd be a very quick success. And I don't think Russia can draw out a long war. No country can fight long wars. We fought in Iraq and Afghanistan for years, and look how they turn out. Russians are taking more losses here. So, yeah, are the Russians powerful? Yes, the Russians are more powerful than the Ukrainians. Have the Russians got the resupply that can come in now that the sanctions have been put on? probably not as well as what the Ukrainians are getting from the West. So they're getting more weapons in. So really it's even it out to a certain degree. Has Russia launched all of its military onto this special operation? Of course not. It has a vast navy. It has submarines. It has assets. It has nuclear weapons. But I think, in my personal opinion, if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, this war would have probably drawn in NATO. NATO would probably have drawn in war. It is that deterrent of nuclear weapons that have stopped it escalating at the moment to the next level as such. But yeah, Russia is a country that should be feared in the sense of its military, especially its artillery and its rockets. How good them rockets are, the accuracy of them rockets, they're not all as accurate. They haven't got as many of them. But yeah, of course, Russia hasn't put everything into this war so far. Just like the Americans and the Brits didn't put everything into Iraq. You need to keep a reserve in case something else happens. And knowing that the Russians are busy elsewhere around the world with lots of troops in Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, stuff in Africa. They need to have troops on standby and weapons. But yeah, definitely we're seeing here that Russia has failed in several operations on here. And that's not me saying they lost everything, because of course they're holding lots of ground as such. But yeah, I personally don't think the Russians are as good as what they are. And I think very much if there was to go a war between Russia and NATO, NATO will pretty much kick their ass.
Yeah, I have a bit of opinion on that. I think the nuclear weapons are actually saving a lot more lives than they would potentially take. As far as no one at the moment is going to fire a nuclear weapon. But if they didn't have them, NATO would have been involved.
Yeah.
And instead of tens or maybe into the hundreds of thousands killed, there would have been millions killed so far, because it would have been the complete Russia and their powers to stand with them and NATO going head to head, and that's something that's just
No one wants
don't
that.
want. What is your thoughts about potential NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine at this point?
No, I don't think NATO physical boots on the ground, whatever, will come into Ukraine, because that is an escalation. Even though Putin isn't at war with Ukraine as such, is that special operation. They could go, well, you're not at war with the country, why can't we? And before the war, there was NATO troops here that were doing training and stuff for the Ukrainians post 2014. But I personally don't think NATO troops will enter Ukraine officially. Excuse me. In an unofficial capacity, of course, there's NATO here supporting. Is targets in the city, they're getting bombed by the Ukrainians. Where they're getting that information from is from the West and from NATO, from intelligence pictures. This is where the Russians are. So NATO's very active in this war. There's no hiding that. People can't sugarcoat it and say NATO's not involved, but they're indirectly involved to a degree. That you're not seeing boots on the ground, weapons pointing with actual NATO soldiers. But that could always change. We don't know. But I don't think there's an appetite for that. I don't think the US wants that. I don't think Russia wants that. I think Putin just wants this now to play out for a few more months now, and then go, right, we're taking Donbass, we're keeping Crimea, let's go back to where we were.
As someone who's had a lot of experience in Arctic warfare, cold environments, how do you see that this war is going to change in the next really 4 to 6 weeks? We're going to start seeing snow settling on the ground, and we've seen in the last 2 weeks you and I have been together, the temperatures go from mid-30s to now high in the teens. How do you see that, and what's it like operating in those conditions compared to now?
Yeah, so summertime is, we all know that it's like the offensive start in the spring, move out to summer, up to winter. Then will come rainy season where the ground will be very soggy. Then the snow come in. For us, we're not used to it. It's definitely not you being Australian, not used to snow. But the war will slow down, massively slow down. It will be the movement across lines will be restricted to a certain degree. The artillery war will probably step up, because it will be that constant bombardment. But yeah, I think it will be not a stalemate, but it will go into defence positions with just small offensives going in. Small teams, artillery going in, supporting them, trying to take villages and then trying to hold them. So I think, yeah, definitely in winter, it will slow down the advance of the tanks movements, for example. Even soft-skin logistic vehicles moving supplies up will have to slow down. So I think, yeah, they'll probably move into a digging-in phase where the trench systems and then go firm over the winter and just bomb the hell out of each other. I think that's really what's going to happen.
And when it enters that phase, which country do you think has the advantage?
Oh, I think definitely at the moment the Russians have the advantage for artillery. They've got massive. The whole Soviet mentality still moving into today's age is the artillery battle. Is bomb the hell out of things, and the soldiers advance up. So I think the Russians might have advantage with the artillery and the rockets, but at the moment we've seen now HIMARS weapon systems that are coming in from America, which are more targeted onto locations, which then can hit ammo dumps, command posts. So that might bring the advantage up for Ukraine in this war. But it comes down to logistics, and is how much logistics has Russia got to pump into this compared to what's coming across the border from Poland and other countries into Ukraine.
And what about for the rest of Europe? Has the power, the gas, things like that being limited through Russia? How do you think that will go in the winter?
Yeah, I think we live in a soft world where people, rather than just put a jumper or a sweater on, would start moaning that they can't have their temperature at a certain degree, at a certain Celsius. Yeah, I think definitely Russia is using it as blackmail, but at the same time, it's their natural resource. The West has put sanctions on them. They can use that to blackmail the world. I totally get that. I get why they're doing that. The average person at home, the Karen at home, that's going to be affected by the whole world is affected by the price of fuel going up and energy. And that's why a lot of people might lose the appetite supporting Ukraine. They go, well, we supported Ukraine to begin with. Now, all of a sudden, I'm paying X amount of thousands for my energy bills. What's going on with that war? Let's stop that war. And they might actually bring more people to try to talk about stopping the war, rather than at the moment not many people talk about stopping this war, about how do we continue this war. That might give a good narrative to what's going on here. But yeah, across the West, it's having a massive impact already about energy prices, how that plans out. But I think this goes to show that economies are linked. Like World War II, economies were very different. We had empires like the British Empire, for example, and the US, and we had all these the Chinese and the Japanese, and we had all these different kind of economies that work in slightly independently. In this day and age, economies are linked through the world, and through finance and everything else, and then through energy. That when you're reliant on a certain country for your energy, and something like this happens, it shows how you need to be more self-sufficient. You need to have them, so natural energy, the solar panels, the wind farms and stuff like that. Because I think the world has been too reliant on Russia for energy, especially Europe. And we saw it during COVID, when the world was too reliant on China, and we couldn't get stuff coming into countries because China, the restrictions and stuff. So I think at the moment, it's a dangerous place that the world's slowly drifting apart to go, we need to be more of an island rather than an international community. But yeah, the fuel energy prices are ridiculous at the moment. It's going to have a massive struggle on businesses and just individuals. And do you think governments lock people down in their homes for years, months at a time, with COVID? It's having that knock-on effect that people, the standard of living is dropping for a lot of people because there's a real struggle.
With that, you mentioned, the West being involved here, and the West support made right up from the average citizen due to, well, I'm paying this much for my electricity bill now, I'm not going to donate to Ukraine or support it. Do you think the West has had an effect on sort of making sure Ukraine doesn't seek a diplomatic solution, that West has some sort of influence in keep pushing the war, keep pushing the war?
Of course.
Because it's a massive business. The biggest business in the West is the military.
Yeah, let's not be under any illusions about the arms industries and how much influence they have at lobbying in certain governments to keep wars going, for example. Can I say that is why the war's ongoing, that the West doesn't really support the war, they're just supporting their economy and their money? To a certain degree, of course, yeah, 100%. It'd be foolish to say that, to rule that out totally, to go, no, they want to support Ukraine because they believe in their right to self-determination. Of course, that plays a part of it. We all know big governments and business, big business support governments. And when it comes to lobbying groups, people putting pressure on someone and go, well, we want contracts, kind of thing. But also, after the war, there'll be a lot of contracts in Ukraine. We saw it in Iraq, where so many British and American companies swamped Iraq to do the rebuilding. They were fighting that. Of course, arms industry is linked to a lot of governments and stuff. I wouldn't say, for example, from being a Brit, I wouldn't say that from the British support in Ukraine. I think that was just due to Boris Johnson actually 100% believing in supporting Ukraine rather than thinking about arms companies. That was my opinion. We've got a new Prime Minister now, so that may change as such. But definitely, of course, prolonging the war here is supporting economies elsewhere.
Yeah. And all you have to do is, I guess, look at the stock prices of defence industries companies on the 23rd of February.
Let's go buy stocks in arms.
And look at it on the 25th of February. Guarantee Nancy Pelosi was in all of it.
Well, no comment on that one.
That's my comment.
But yeah, definitely. Do you know what I mean? But that plays into people's conspiracies theories. People then start saying, "Oh well, this war isn't really happening because it's all about business." People need to understand that countries survive of its economy. You need to protect your people for your economy. That's just nature of the business. That's what happens. You can't just go, forget it, fuck my economy. Let's just whatever. So that does play a part in it, and people need to understand it. What people can't do is just make everything into a conspiracy. That is the only because A is happening, B is happening. No, because there's like so much that goes on in between it. So you can't just say that corresponds to that.
Yeah. And what about the sort of precedence that the Russian economy is now stronger than ever? The ruble is at all-time highs. Like at least the way I see it, is a lot of that is inflated due to any foreign money in the country had to be exchanged into rubles. Therefore, you have supply and demand issue and a massive defence industry in Russia. Is that all
I'm not an economist. I'm a filmmaker. I don't know the ins and outs of how economies work. But what I will say is, like you're saying, inflation. They're just printing more stuff. It's all that hocus pocus trying to make it look more like we can survive without you. No economy can survive on its own. Simple as that is. Like what I mentioned a minute ago, the world is so interlinked that we need one another to work together. That I don't think Russia will survive on its own. It can't survive on its own. Well, of course it can. Like look at Iran. Iran is under heavy sanctions, been ridiculous sanctions for so many years. Why? But it's surviving. It continues going, but it's not. The standard of living isn't increasing to a certain degree. So, of course, Russia will survive if these sanctions remain. But really, are they going to be stronger than everyone else's economy? Probably not. It is hocus pocus, really, that kind of stuff. But hopefully this war can end and then sanctions can be dropped, reintegrating Russia back into the world, because we need Russia. Of course we need Russia. And only that is, under Trump and Putin, there was an actual good relationship that was going on. And you could see that, and many people, we even talked about it the other day, is that if Trump was in power, would this war have started? Is it only because Biden was in power that the Russians thought, oh, we can go to war now? Would he have pushed that line with Trump? We don't know. I'm not saying I support Trump. I'm just saying on an international geopolitical forum, how would that have played out? So, yeah, time will tell. But Putin looks as strong as ever to his people, potentially, because he's now, I'm fighting the Western sanctions. I mean, they're causing your struggle and your pain. I'm a strong leader, keep it going. So yeah, but in my opinion, this war does need to stop. But at the same time, it needs to stop when Ukraine is ready to stop fighting. At the moment, Ukrainians aren't saying, let's stop the war. They're saying, let's keep fighting this war. Let's push Russian troops out of here. Because like you mentioned earlier, they could have, what leader in the world would have stopped, other than Chamberlain, who was trying to negotiate with Hitler at the time in 1939, would stop a war within a couple of days and go, oh, it's career suicide. People would have been like, we want the fight. I saw this in Armenia when I was filming there, that people got, some people were like, oh, you could have stopped the war on day 2. It's like, no, the men wanted to fight the war. The government wanted to fight the war, because if they hadn't fought the war, what would they have lost long term? And if Ukraine had given up early, what they could have lost everything. So it is that right and self-determination to go, okay, we gave it our best shot. Now it's time to negotiate.
Yeah. Well, mate, thank you very much for...
I went on longer than I thought.
Ah, it was great. Where can people find you and what should they look into to see your work?
It's a great plug, I like it.
This,
so people can find me on social media, Instagram, Emile Ghessen. That's Ghe. Well, you got to put it in the...
Yeah, I'll be in the bio, yeah.
LinkedIn, TikTok, you name it, I'm everywhere, social media stuff. And then if anyone wants to watch my work, my films, send me a message on social media. I'll send you a link to them, because I generally do like feature films, like 90 minutes documentaries, but yeah, I do loads of food posts as well. Food blogger,
a meal with a meal,
and people prefer my food than actually my filming work.
That's me with the chilies. You've got to keep that content rolling on.
Easy content.
Yeah, bloody oath. Okay, thank you, mate. I
Cheers,
really
mate.
appreciate it.
Thank you very much.